The note was an anomaly in the ordered cosmos of Julian Vance's world. It lay on the expansive, mirror-polished surface of his obsidian desk, a single discordant speck of pulp in a penthouse office that floated 48 stories above the ceaseless chaos of New York City. His world was one of controlled variables and predictable outcomes, a sterile environment of brushed steel, smoked glass, and the silent, omniscient hum of servers that processed the lifeblood of his multi-billion-dollar empire, Vance Holdings. Nothing entered this sanctum without the explicit, almost precognitive approval of his executive assistant, Evelyn, a woman who organized his life with the chilling precision of a military strategist. And yet, this crudely folded square of a cheap paper napkin, had somehow breached the perimeter. He had been in the middle of finalizing the acquisition of a German tech firm, a ruthless but elegant maneuver that would gut the company's R&D department, but add a crucial patent portfolio to his own. It was a clean, impersonal act of corporate predation, the kind of work that had made him a legend and hollowed him out in equal measure. He'd looked up from the glowing screen, his eyes tired of the endless columns of numbers, and there it was, as if it had simply materialized from the filtered air. Unfolding it felt transgressive, a violation of the pristine silence he had paid so handsomely to construct around himself. The paper was flimsy, stained with what looked like a ring of coffee. The script, scrawled in a frantic, spidery hand with a cheap ballpoint pen, was filled with a desperate energy. She takes the leftovers. Watch her. Back alley after 11. Warehouse 17B, Port Morris. She's not what you think. Julian Vance, a man whose personal wealth was a fluid, astronomical figure that eclipsed the GDP of several small countries, found his gaze snagged by those last 5 words. She's not what you think. For 3 decades, he had meticulously crafted his public and private persona, ensuring everyone thought of him in precisely the same terms: brilliant, implacable, and fundamentally untouchable. He was a creature of silent boardrooms and whispered back-channel negotiations, a man who viewed the entire human race through the dispassionate lens of assets and liabilities. This note, however, wasn't a stock tip or a piece of corporate espionage. It was messy, intimate, and pointed like a dagger at a woman who was, in the grand scheme of his life, a complete unknown. A waitress. Her name, according to the small, scratched plastic tag pinned to her uniform, was Izzy. She worked the late shift at the Starlight Diner, a relic from another era wedged between a laundromat and a check-cashing place in a part of town his driver usually accelerated through. Julian had developed a strange, nocturnal habit of going there. He would leave his palatial apartment, where the silence was often deafening, and have his driver drop him 2 blocks away. He'd walk to the diner, not for its notoriously burnt coffee or its greasy, heart-stopping food, but for the profound, beautiful anonymity it offered. In the Starlight Diner, surrounded by third-shift nurses, long-haul truckers, and the city's other lonely ghosts, he was not Julian Vance, the titan of industry. He was just Mr. J, the quiet man in the corner booth who always ordered a slice of apple pie he never seemed to finish. Izzy was the one who had given him the name. She was a woman who looked to be in her late 30s, but carried the exhaustion of someone much older. It wasn't a temporary tiredness. It was a deep, foundational weariness, etched into the very lines of her face, a permanent shadow in the hollows beneath her eyes. Yet she moved with a quiet, fluid efficiency that Julian, a connoisseur of competence in any form, found strangely captivating. She never offered the plastic, saccharine smile that was the currency of the service industry. She never complained. She simply performed her duties with a detached courtesy, refilling his coffee, taking his order, and treating him with the exact same measure of respect she gave the construction worker with calloused hands or the student hunched over a textbook. The note suggested this carefully observed surface was a facade. It implied a secret, a hidden layer. And in Julian's world, secrets were the ultimate form of currency, the leverage that moved markets and toppled kings. This secret felt small, pathetic even. A waitress stealing leftover food. It was a story of simple, sordid desperation. So why did it intrigue him? Perhaps, he mused, it was the sheer novelty. For once, this was a mystery whose solution wouldn't be found on a balance sheet. That evening, he broke his routine. He didn't take the chauffeured Maybach. Instead, he drove himself, taking a nondescript gray sedan he kept in his private garage for just such occasions that had become vanishingly rare. He slipped into his usual booth, the cracked red vinyl sighing under the weight of his bespoke suit. The air was a thick cocktail of smells: frying onions, old coffee grounds, bleach, and a faint, sweet smell of despair. It was an assault on his senses, a world away from the sterile, ozonized air of his office. Izzy approached, her notepad held ready. She looked worse than usual. The shadows under her eyes were darker, and he noticed a faint, dark, purple bruise peeking out from beneath the cuff of her left sleeve. She saw him looking, and instinctively, almost imperceptibly, tugged the fabric down over her wrist. The gesture was so quick, so practiced. It spoke of a long familiarity with hiding things. "The usual, Mr. J?" Her voice was low and raspy, the sound of too many hours in a noisy room. "Just coffee tonight, Izzy," he replied, his gaze deliberately neutral now. "Long day." "Aren't they all?" she said, the words less a statement than a shared sigh, and moved away. For the next 2 hours, Julian did what he did best. He observed. He watched her navigate the small, chaotic world of the diner. He saw the subtle grace in the way she balanced 3 heavy plates on one arm, the flicker of genuine warmth in her eyes as she shared a brief, whispered joke with an elderly regular, the almost invisible stiffening of her spine whenever the manager, Marcus Thorne, was near. Thorne was a man who seemed to ooze a cheap, rancid confidence. He had slicked back hair, a smile that never reached his predatory eyes, and a way of moving that was both lazy and menacing. Julian had encountered men like Thorne at every level of the corporate food chain. They were petty tyrants, men who derived their sense of power not from creating, but from controlling and diminishing others. The catalyst arrived with the clatter of stainless steel on linoleum. Izzy, rushing to deliver an order, collided with a busboy and a fork fell from her tray. It was a minor, insignificant event, but to Thorne, it was an opportunity. "Rossi!" His voice cut through the diner's low hum like a whip. "What the hell do you think you're doing? That's company property you're throwing around." Izzy bent down to retrieve the fork, her face a blank mask of composure. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne. It was an accident." "Sorry doesn't pay the bills," he sneered, his voice loud enough to make several patrons turn their heads. "That's another $5 out of your tips. Maybe if you focused more on your job and less on whatever gutter you crawl back to at night, you'd be less of a clumsy mess." The public humiliation was brutal and deliberate. Julian felt a cold, familiar anger tighten in his chest. It was the vulgar spectacle of power, preying on the powerless, a dynamic he had mastered and profited from in the abstract world of finance. But seeing it here, in this greasy, fluorescent-lit space, directed at this woman, felt raw and obscene. He watched the other patrons. A few looked down at their plates, embarrassed. Most just looked through her, their indifference a form of silent complicity. The system wasn't just broken. It was actively hostile, and its silence was its greatest weapon. Izzy didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply straightened up, the fork in her hand, and said, "Yes, Mr. Thorne." Her dignity in that moment was a fortress he could not breach. Her shift ended precisely at 11 p.m. She untied her stained apron, hung it on a hook in the kitchen, and slipped out the back door into the alley without a word to anyone. The note had said after 11. This was the moment of truth. Julian left a $50 bill on the table for his $2 coffee, a silent, impotent gesture of defiance, and followed. The night was cold, the city air thick with a damp chill that promised rain. Izzy walked fast, her shoulders hunched against the wind, a worn canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder. He had expected her to head for the nearest bus stop or subway station. Instead, she turned down the dark, narrow alley that ran behind the diner. Julian's mind, conditioned by a lifetime of cynicism, jumped to the darkest conclusions. A drug deal, a clandestine meeting with a loan shark, a pathetic, desperate transaction in the shadows. He parked the sedan half a block away, the engine's soft electric hum dying into silence. He got out and followed on foot, his handmade Italian leather shoes making no sound on the grimy pavement. The alley reeked of stale beer, rotting garbage, and the quiet desperation of the city's forgotten corners. He saw her up ahead, near the large, overflowing dumpsters. A figure detached itself from the shadows. It was a man, large and hulking. Julian's hand instinctively went to his phone, ready to dial 911. But the interaction was not what he expected. The man was one of the diner's cooks, a heavy-set man named Sal. He grunted a greeting and passed Izzy 2 large, opaque, black garbage bags. They were heavy. She staggered under their weight. No money changed hands. There was no furtive conversation, just a quiet nod of solidarity. Sal patted her shoulder awkwardly, then disappeared back into the kitchen's steamy light. The note had said leftovers. Julian had pictured her furtively scraping discarded food from plates into a small container for herself. This was something else entirely. These were commercial-grade trash bags, sealed and full. He continued his surveillance, a strange mixture of dread and an almost academic curiosity churning within him. He was a man who hated unsolved puzzles. She didn't go home. She began to walk, dragging the heavy bags with a weary determination. She moved through the deserted streets of the industrial zone, a lone, small figure dwarfed by the hulking, silent silhouettes of warehouses and shuttered factories. Her destination, as the note had foretold, was a long, low brick building with boarded-up windows and a large, rusted metal door bearing a faded, stenciled number, 17. Julian watched from the shadows across the street, the cold seeping into his expensive overcoat. This was the end game. A theft ring? A place where she sorted through the trash for salvageable goods? Every logical, cynical fiber of his being told him this story ended in squalor and criminality. He watched her struggle with a heavy, ancient-looking padlock on the door. It finally gave way with a tortured groan, and the door swung inward, spilling a rectangle of warm, yellow light onto the dark, cracked pavement. For a moment, her tired silhouette was framed against the light, a figure of profound weariness. Then she disappeared inside, dragging her heavy burden with her. He waited for what felt like an eternity, though his watch told him it was only 20 minutes. The silence was absolute. What was she doing in there? The uncertainty was more galling than any sordid confirmation would have been. Julian Vance was not a man who waited for answers to come to him. He was a man who acquired them. He crossed the street, his mind rehearsing a script. He would be calm, direct, and in control. He would offer her money, a clean, simple transaction to purchase the truth. It was the only way he knew how to interact with a problem. He reached the door, which she had left slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside, his senses braced for the smell of decay or stolen goods. The smell that hit him was chicken soup. The interior of the warehouse was vast, cavernous, and brutally cold. But in the far corner, a small, vibrant universe of warmth and light had been carved out of the industrial gloom. A dozen portable propane heaters glowed with a fierce orange life. Strings of mismatched Christmas lights, a cheerful, defiant constellation of reds, greens, and blues were strung between the massive steel support beams, casting a soft, magical glow over the scene below. And at the center of it all was Izzy. She was not the same woman from the diner. The weary, beaten-down waitress was gone. In her place was a figure of luminous energy and purpose. A genuine, unforced smile lit up her face. Her movements were no longer just efficient. They were graceful, infused with a deep sense of mission. She moved between several large, steaming industrial pots set up on folding tables, ladling thick, fragrant soup into styrofoam bowls. Her voice, no longer a tired rasp, was warm and clear as it carried over the quiet murmurs of the crowd. "Easy now, Frank. This is a hot one. Maria, did you and little Sophia get enough bread? There's more if you need it." Her guests were the city's invisible population, the chronically homeless, their faces weathered maps of hard lives, the elderly, abandoned by family and forgotten by the state, young families with children whose eyes held a gravity that broke Julian's heart, huddled together for warmth, clutching the hot bowls in their hands. There were at least 40 people there, sitting on a motley collection of folding chairs, upturned milk crates, and old blankets. They were eating the diner's leftovers, the unsold rotisserie chickens from the day, the vegetables deemed too bruised or misshapen for paying customers, the day-old bread all of it transformed by some quiet alchemy into a hearty, nourishing feast. Julian stood frozen in the shadows, near the entrance, a ghost in a $4,000 suit, utterly out of place and entirely unseen. He was a spectator at a sacred ritual. He watched Izzy kneel down to speak to a small girl with tangled hair, gently wiping a smudge of gravy from the child's cheek with her thumb. He saw her listen with rapt attention to the rambling, disjointed story of an elderly man in a tattered army jacket, placing a comforting hand on his arm, making him feel, for a few precious moments, seen and heard. This wasn't a registered charity. A charity had fundraising galas, glossy brochures, a board of directors, and a public relations department. This was something far more raw, more fundamental. This was a guerrilla act of compassion. He saw the worn silver locket that always hung around her neck, an object he'd barely registered at the diner. Here, under the soft, multicolored lights, it seemed to catch and reflect the warmth of the scene. A tiny, personal star. A profound, seismic shift occurred within him, a tectonic cracking in the foundations of his cynical worldview. For his entire adult life, he had viewed the world as a complex, impersonal machine of interlocking financial interests, a game to be won. He had forgotten, or perhaps never known, that it was also a tapestry of quiet, desperate struggles and small, defiant acts of grace. The anonymous note had not been an accusation. It had been an invitation. She's not what you think. The author was right. He had thought she was a victim, a petty thief, a casualty of a cruel system. He had been spectacularly, monumentally wrong. She wasn't a casualty. She was a warrior, fighting a desperate, clandestine war against human misery with the only weapons she had: discarded food and a boundless heart. He slipped back out into the cold night before he could be discovered, his mind reeling. The image of Izzy's illuminated face burned into his retinas. The secrecy now made perfect, heartbreaking sense. An operation this fragile, this dependent on smuggled goods, and one woman's sheer force of will could not survive the light of day. It was a sanctuary, and men like Thorne were the predators that prowled its borders. He would crush it without a second thought, not just out of spite, but because her quiet, defiant goodness was a silent, infuriating rebuke to his own petty, parasitic existence. Back in the sterile silence of his penthouse, the city, a glittering, indifferent jewel, spread out below him. Julian Vance did what he did best. He went to war. He didn't call a clumsy private investigator who might leave a trail. He made a call on an encrypted line to Alistair Finch, his head of global security. Alistair was a discreet, terrifyingly competent former MI6 agent who had handled situations for Julian, ranging from corporate espionage in Shanghai to a kidnapping threat in Sao Paulo. Alistair. Julian's voice was quiet, but it held a new, cold charge. I have a project for you. It requires your utmost discretion. As they all do, sir, came the dry, British reply. I want to know everything about a man named Marcus Thorne. He's the manager of a place called the Starlight Diner. I want a full workup: financials, debts, connections, habits. I want to know who he talks to, where he goes, what he eats for breakfast. Concurrently, I want your forensic accounting team to conduct a deep dive audit of the diner's supply chain, inventory management, and reported waste. I have a strong suspicion of systemic fraud." There was a brief pause on the line. "A diner, sir? Are we certain?" "We are," Julian confirmed, his voice flat. "And Alistair, one more thing. I want you to find out who holds the title for Warehouse 17B in Port Morris. Then, I want you to arrange for an anonymous, untraceable delivery to that address. Industrial-grade heating units, a full commercial-grade kitchen, setup, gas range, convection oven, refrigeration units, and a truckload of non-perishable food staples. I want it all to appear on their doorstep, with no paperwork, no trail, no explanation. Make it look like it fell from the sky." "Consider it a miracle, sir," Alistair said, without a hint of irony. As he ended the call, Julian Vance felt a flicker of an emotion he couldn't remember experiencing since he was a young man, before the money and the power had insulated him from the world. It wasn't the thrill of the kill he felt during a hostile takeover. It wasn't the satisfaction of a profitable quarter. It felt, for lack of a better word, like purpose. The game had changed. He was no longer a detached observer of a pathetic human drama. He had become an unseen ally, a silent, powerful guardian angel moving in the shadows. He would protect the small, warm circle of light Izzy had carved out of the darkness, and he would bring the full, crushing weight of his world down on the man who threatened to extinguish it. Alistair's report, delivered 48 hours later via a self-deleting encrypted file, was a masterclass in efficient intelligence gathering. It painted a portrait of Marcus Thorne that was both pathetic and monstrous. He was a man drowning in debt. Gambling markers from an illegal poker game in Queens, a high-interest loan on a failed sports bar, and alimony payments to an ex-wife with a taste for luxury he could no longer afford. His salary as a diner manager was a single leaky bucket against a tidal wave of financial desperation. The forensic accounting data was the kill shot. It was a ghost world of fabricated numbers and systematic theft. Alistair's team had hacked into the central servers of Omnidine Corp., the massive, faceless food services conglomerate that owned the Starlight Diner franchise. They cross-referenced the diner's inventory logs with the original shipping manifests from the suppliers. The discrepancy was a chasm. Thorne was consistently logging deliveries at 15 to 20% higher than the actual received product. Furthermore, he was reporting astronomical levels of spoilage and damaged goods, writing off thousands of pounds of fresh produce, meat, and dairy products each month, a rate 10 times higher than any other Omnidine franchise in the tri-state area. The truth was elegantly simple and utterly depraved. Thorne was running a sophisticated scam. He was over-ordering supplies on the company's dime, selling the untaxed, unaccounted-for surplus to a network of less reputable cash-only restaurants and caterers, and then cooking the books to show the difference as waste. The leftovers he magnanimously allowed Sal the cook to give to Izzy were not an act of kindness, but a crucial component of his criminal enterprise. They were the perfect cover, the theatrical prop that made his fraudulent spoilage numbers seem plausible. He was using her secret, life-saving charity as an unwitting alibi for his own greed. Julian felt the revelation like a shard of ice lodging in his gut. The anonymous note now made a different kind of sense. It was likely from a disgruntled or fired employee, Perhaps a driver or a dishwasher who had seen too much. Someone who knew about Izzy taking food and knew about Thorne's shady dealings, but who mistakenly assumed they were partners in crime. The irony was corrosive. Thorne had turned Izzy's greatest virtue into his most effective shield. Julian's anger was not a hot, explosive thing. It was a cold, quiet, and intensely focused rage. It was the calculated anger of a man who dismantles corporations for a living, who understands that the most effective demolition begins by systematically destroying the foundations. Over the next week, he orchestrated his countermove with the meticulous precision of a chess grandmaster planning a checkmate 20 moves in advance. Alistair's team, operating with ghost-like efficiency, planted state-of-the-art micro-cameras in the diner's storeroom and Thorne's cramped, messy office. They captured crystal-clear video of Thorne conducting his cash deals with a shady food distributor, stuffing thick wads of bills into a battered envelope. They recorded his tirades against the staff, his voice a venomous cocktail of contempt and condescension. The most damning piece of the puzzle, however, was yet to come. While the digital net was tightening, Julian continued his nocturnal visits to the diner. He watched Izzy with a new, profound sense of admiration and urgency. He saw the almost imperceptible flinch when Thorne's shadow fell over her, the meticulous way she triple-checked every order, every bill, as if subconsciously building a defense against an accusation she could feel was perpetually hanging in the air. She was a woman of unimpeachable honor, trapped in a cage she couldn't see. One evening, he witnessed the keystone of Thorne's malevolence fall into place. A new delivery of produce had arrived, and Thorne was overseeing the unloading with his usual air of bored authority. A single crate of tomatoes, out of a pallet of 30, had been jostled in transit, bruising a few of the fruits on the top layer. "This whole case is garbage," Thorne declared loudly, for the benefit of the delivery driver. "The whole thing's a write-off. Tell your dispatcher I'm marking it as a total loss. Omnidyne's insurance can eat it." Later that night, Julian watched the recorded footage from the storeroom camera. He saw Thorne carefully load that same crate of perfectly good tomatoes into the trunk of his own car for his black market sales. But before he left, he called Izzy into the storeroom. Julian leaned closer to his monitor, listening to the audio. "Rossi," Thorne said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "That tomato shipment came in damaged. Total mess. But no sense in letting it all go to the rats, right? If you want to take some for your strays, take it now. I'll look the other way. Just make sure you log it out properly. Damaged in transit. Discarded. Got it? If corporate ever asks, you saw the driver drop the whole pallet. It was a disaster. You're my witness." Julian leaned back, a cold fury settling deep in his bones. It was diabolically brilliant. He wasn't just using her charity as a cover. He was actively, deliberately implicating her in his crimes. He was seeding her path with legal landmines, constructing a false narrative where, if an auditor ever did come sniffing around, he could sacrifice her as the primary suspect, the compassionate but criminally negligent waitress, stealing company property to feed the homeless. He was turning her into the author of her own destruction. That was the final piece. Julian now had the what, the how, and the why. It was time to orchestrate the when and the where. Through his corporate intelligence channels, he learned that Omnidyne Corp. was holding its quarterly Regional Excellence Awards ceremony in 3 days. It was a typically soulless corporate event, a self-congratulatory affair where mid-level executives handed out acrylic plaques for Excellence in Hospitality and Outstanding Manager of the Quarter. Thanks to his fraudulent cost-slashing profit margins, Marcus Thorne was the front-runner for the latter. The ceremony was to be held in the grand ballroom of a downtown hotel. It was the perfect stage for a public execution. Julian made a single phone call. The recipient was Robert Carlyle, the CEO of Omnidyne Corp. Julian had once engaged Carlyle in a brutal hostile takeover bid for another company years ago, a battle he had won so decisively that Carlyle still spoke of it in hushed, traumatized tones. The CEO's voice, when he answered, was a mixture of fear and wary deference. "Carlyle," Julian said, his voice as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Julian Vance. I trust you remember me." "Vance," Carlyle stammered. "Of course. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "There is no pleasure involved. A matter of significant internal fraud at your company has come to my attention. It involves one of your franchise managers, a man named Marcus Thorne. It's a cancer in your system. However, I am also aware of an opportunity for you to turn a potentially catastrophic liability into a public relations masterpiece. I will be attending your awards dinner on Thursday. We have much to discuss. Do not speak of this to anyone." He hung up before Carlyle could formulate a response, leaving the CEO to stew in a potent broth of terror and confusion. The night of the awards, the hotel ballroom was a sea of cheap suits and forced smiles. Julian, an honored guest of the visibly sweating CEO, sat at a secluded table at the back, a predator watching the herd. He saw Izzy moving through the crowd. Thorne, in a final act of petty cruelty, had forced her and 2 other waitstaff from the diner to work the event, serving champagne and hors d'oeuvres to the very corporate overlords who were blind to their daily struggles. She looked like a ghost in the machine, her face pale and drawn under the garish light of the crystal chandeliers. "What in God's name is this about, Vance?" Carlyle whispered, frantically adjusting his bow tie. "Thorne's numbers are the best in the entire state. He's a model manager. His numbers are a work of fiction," Julian said calmly, his eyes fixed on Thorne, who was basking in the adulation of his peers near the stage. "And the author is about to have his book reviewed. Publicly." As the presenter, a slick regional vice president, began the preamble for the Manager of the Quarter award, Julian gave a nearly imperceptible nod to Alistair, who was disguised as a hotel AV technician, his hand resting on a laptop near the main control booth. "And the winner," the VP boomed, tearing open a golden envelope, "for his unprecedented cost efficiency, his community leadership, and for posting record-breaking profit margins, Mr. Marcus Thorne of the Starlight Diner." A wave of polite applause filled the room. Thorne strode to the stage, his chest puffed out with a peacock's vanity, a triumphant smirk plastered on his face. He shook the VP's hand, accepted the cheap acrylic plaque, and leaned into the microphone. "Thank you, thank you. I'm humbled. I always say, it's all about trimming the fat, running a tight ship, and empowering your hard-working team." At that moment, the 2 massive projector screens flanking the stage, which had been displaying the Omnidyne corporate logo, flickered and changed. The applause sputtered and died, replaced by a confused murmur. The first image to appear was a high-resolution still from the storeroom camera. Marcus Thorne, his face perfectly illuminated, accepting a thick envelope of cash from his black market distributor. Thorne froze at the podium, his smirk dissolving into a mask of slack-jawed horror. The screen flickered again. It was an audio file now, his own voice, amplified by the ballroom's powerful sound system echoing through the stunned silence. "This whole case is garbage. Mark it as a total loss. Tell your dispatcher I'm marking it as a total loss." Then, a new video clip. Thorne, clear as day, loading the supposedly garbage crate of tomatoes into the trunk of his sedan. Another audio clip followed, his conspiratorial whisper to Izzy, filling the room with its poison. "Log it out properly. Damaged in transit, discarded. Got it? If corporate ever asks, you saw the driver drop the whole pallet. You're my witness." Finally, the screen filled with a stark, brutal spreadsheet. On the left side was Thorne's reported inventory and waste logs for the past 12 months. On the right, the supplier's original delivery manifests. The discrepancies were highlighted in a virulent shade of red. At the bottom of the screen, in a font size usually reserved for declarations of war, was the final tally of the fraud. $217,458. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Thorne stood on the stage, a statue of pure guilt, the plaque for Manager of the Quarter slipping from his nerveless, sweaty fingers and clattering to the floor. Robert Carlyle looked as if he was about to have a coronary. As if summoned by the damning evidence, 2 uniformed NYPD officers and a plain-clothed detective from the fraud division entered from the back of the ballroom. They began walking, deliberately and calmly, through the parted sea of stunned executives, their path leading directly to the stage. The showdown was over. There was no shouting, no dramatic denial, just the cold, quiet, and inescapable arrival of consequences. Thorne didn't even try to run. He was escorted off the stage, past the dumbstruck faces of his colleagues, his petty reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with the quiet, final click of handcuffs. In the ensuing chaos, Julian's eyes found Izzy. She was standing by a service station, a tray of untouched champagne flutes, forgotten in her hands. Her face was a maelstrom of shock, confusion, and a dawning, incredulous relief. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an explanation. And finally, they landed on him. She wasn't looking at Mr. J, her quiet, lonely customer. She was looking at Julian Vance, the apex predator sitting next to the CEO, the man who had so clearly and ruthlessly orchestrated this entire spectacle. Their gazes locked across the crowded room, and in that silent, charged moment, an understanding passed between them. The board had been reset. The next morning, Izzy was summoned to the Omnidyne corporate headquarters in Midtown. She walked through the imposing marble lobby, fully expecting to be fired, to be named as an accomplice, to be ground up in the legal machinery of Thorne's downfall. Instead, a grim-faced executive assistant led her directly to the main boardroom on the 50th floor. Robert Carlyle was there, flanked by the entire regional management team, all of them looking pale and chastened. And at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, occupying the chairman's seat as if he owned it, sat Julian Vance. "Ms. Rossi," Carlyle began, his voice stripped of its usual bluster. "On behalf of Omnidyne Corporation, we wish to offer you our most profound and sincere apology. We have failed you, as an employee and as a decent human being. The actions of Mr. Thorne are a deep stain on the reputation of this company, a stain we are committed to eradicating. Julian spoke next, his voice calm and direct. Izzy, he said, using her name with a familiarity that felt both strange and comforting. What you have been building at Warehouse 17B, it's extraordinary. Izzy's eyes widened in panic. Her secret was out. I can explain that. It was just the discarded food, the things they were throwing away anyway. I never took anything that wasn't. We know what it was, Julian interrupted gently. We know that you have been running a vital community service, a lifeline for dozens of people, entirely on your own, with no funding, and under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Omnidyne is in your debt, and frankly, so is this city. Carlyle cleared his throat, picking up his cue. As the first act of our new company-wide community and social responsibility initiative, Omnidyne would like to officially sponsor your project. Effective immediately, we will take over the lease on the warehouse, indefinitely. We will provide a weekly, fully stocked delivery of fresh food, produce, and supplies from our distribution centers. No questions asked. Furthermore, we are creating a new salaried position. We would like to offer you the role of executive director of what we will call the Starlight Foundation, with a starting salary and benefits package that reflects the profound importance of the work you do. Izzy sank into one of the plush leather chairs, the words washing over her like a tidal wave. The weight of years of struggle, of hiding, of fearing, of carrying the immense burden of her promise alone seemed to lift from her shoulders all at once. Tears, hot and silent, welled in her eyes and traced paths down her weary face. They were not tears of sadness or even joy, but of a relief so absolute and profound. It was almost painful. Later, after the corporate formalities were concluded and the papers were signed, Julian walked with her out of the towering glass and steel building. They stood on the bustling sidewalk, the city sunlight feeling different, warmer, less hostile than it had just hours before. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice thick with emotion as she looked up at this enigmatic man who had turned her world upside down in order to set it right. "You didn't know me. You didn't have to do any of this." Julian stopped and looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a person. He thought of his silent, empty penthouse, his life of sterile, soulless transactions. He thought of the grubby napkin, the cold alley, the transformative smell of chicken soup in a desolate warehouse. He thought of her bruised wrist and her unbreakable dignity. "For a very long time, I've only invested in businesses," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I invest in assets that promise a quantifiable return. But then I saw what you were doing, Izzy. I saw the light and warmth you were creating in the coldest, darkest corners of this city. And I decided it was time to make a different kind of investment." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small, worn piece of napkin, the note that had started it all. "Someone tried to use this to destroy you. Instead, it led me to the most valuable asset I've ever had the privilege of encountering." His gaze fell to the silver locket that rested against her collarbone, now a symbol, not of a hidden burden, but of a celebrated purpose. Through all of it, the abuse from Thorne, the exhaustion, the fear, you never lost faith, did you? Her hand went to the locket, a sad, gentle smile finally touching her lips. "It was a promise," she said softly, her fingers tracing its worn surface. "It has a picture of my little brother, Michael. We grew up in the foster system, bounced around a lot. We were often hungry, that cold, gnawing kind of hungry that gets into your bones. He got sick when he was 12. Malnutrition, the doctors said, weakened his system. He didn't make it. This," she gestured vaguely towards the city around them. "All of this. It's for him. It's a promise I made to his memory, that as long as I was breathing, no one else would feel that particular kind of cold, that kind of hunger, if I could do anything to stop it." The simple, devastating honesty of her story settled the final piece of the puzzle into place for Julian. This wasn't just charity. It was a memorial. It was an act of defiant, enduring love against a world that had taken too much from her. He didn't offer her a ride in his limousine or invite her into his gilded, empty world. He offered her something far more valuable, far more real. "The foundation will need a board of directors," he said. "It will need a strategic plan. It will need to grow to help more people. If you'll have me, I'd like to be your first board member." Standing on that busy city street, two people from opposite ends of the human experience forged a new and unlikely partnership. It was not built on power or on money, but on a shared, newfound understanding that justice is not always found in a courtroom, that compassion is the most powerful currency of all, and that true wealth is measured not by what you accumulate, but by the warmth you can offer to those who have been left out in the cold. Faith wasn't just restored, it was rebuilt, stronger and brighter, like a constellation of mismatched Christmas lights chasing away the shadows in a forgotten corner of the world.